The United Nations has described the renewed fighting between Hamas militants and Israel as a return to hell on earth for the people of Gaza. Hostilities resumed this morning after negotiators failed to extend what had become a 7-day ceasefire. Officials from the Hamas-run Health Ministry say dozens of Gazans have been killed in the hours since then.
After a week of relative calm, the sound of war has returned to Gaza. Explosions rang out across the enclave, dashing hopes that the truce would again be extended. Israel said it resumed combat after Hamas violated the terms. But Hamas, which the US and the EU have designated a terrorist organization, blames Israel for the breakdown in talks. In the southern city of Rafah, Palestinians raced to find survivors in the rubble.
This is just a house with civilians, people who fled from another area. They're all young and children.
There were similar scenes in nearby Khan Yunis, where a hospital was inundated with wounded civilians.
We were at home, listening to the news when the bombing started. The aircraft bomb destroyed our home. This is the second house of ours that's been destroyed. And this is the nature of the Israeli enemy. What more can I say?
People have now started fleeing Khan Yunis, a city tens of thousands had fled to in recent weeks, seeking refuge from bombardments in the north. Israel is warning Gazans to follow evacuation orders for what it calls the next stage of the war.
The IDF has been sending messages and announcements to the people of Gaza, calling on them to evacuate from specific areas that are being used by Hamas for terrorist activities in the areas of what are, of course, legitimate military targets that will be destroyed in response to the October 7th massacre as Hamas continues to vow another October 7th.
A sign that Israel could be expanding its incursion, leaving Gazans with fewer places to seek shelter.
DW correspondent Ben Fazulin joined us earlier with more details.
Gerhard, it's been a day of rocket attacks from Gaza into Israel, mainly in the south, also some pockets in the north of the country. Hamas and Islamic Jihad taking responsibility for those attacks. The government here blames those rocket attacks on the breakdown in the ceasefire, along with the hostage terms, which it says Hamas is not meeting, refusing to release women. At the same time, Hamas says that Israel has persistently failed to meet its terms. It has been offering dead bodies in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. The dead hostages, it claims, died in Israeli airstrikes. We haven't been able to confirm those deaths yet, though. But it's also been a day of airstrikes in the north, south and centre of the Gaza Strip. That death toll rising by the hour, according to Palestinian officials and Hamas.
Now, more fighting means no more release of Israeli hostages, at least for now. What's the public opinion in Israel on this?
People here are absolutely terrified that the fighting is underway again. They're worried, of course, that their relatives who could be held hostage in the tunnels that Hamas is said to operate in, which are targets of the Israeli military, that they will perish in those targets. 137 hostages we're talking about still in the Gaza Strip, according to the Israeli government. 117 men, 20 women, including 2 children. It's even more horrifying, of course, for those above ground, the Palestinian civilians caught in the crossfire. They are believed to be mainly in the south, but the Israeli campaign having now turned to the south, according to Israeli officials. Those civilians are now going to have to move to the north. It's not safe wherever they go, according to humanitarian bodies. There's no aid getting into the Gaza Strip now that this ceasefire has fallen apart and hospitals are near to collapse.
Now, Qatar says negotiations to restore a truce are still continuing in the background. Also, Hamas officials say that the group would be ready for negotiations. Do you think a new truce is realistic?
Well, Gerhard, up until now, we had a 7-day truce. Who could have believed that? I mean, getting together these two groups which are so different in ideology and method. Hamas, which is meant to have tens of thousands of fighters, but then at the same time a much bigger Israeli force, hundreds of thousands, backed by the US, whereas Hamas is backed by Iran. That is not an easy feat. And also getting the Egyptian officials and the US to the table. Qatar is the mediator in all of this, is also home to some Hamas officials, and managing to get that 7-day ceasefire in place was a huge thing. But Israel is very keen to get back to the fighting. It says that's what's going to pressure Hamas to release the hostages, and that was the pressure it claims got those hostages out in the first place. So it's going to be very tricky going ahead.
Now, Ben, what is known about the strategy of the IDF in this next phase as it seeks to achieve its goals?
As I mentioned, the IDF, the Israeli military, says it wants to launch a full ground offensive in the south, not just the north. And that's where all the civilians are at the moment. That's the big problem. We're talking about over 15,000 civilian and combatant deaths, according to Palestinian authorities so far. The pressure is on from the US for Israel to make more precise strikes and precise targets and ensure that less or fewer civilians are hurt in the crossfire. But
and we can now talk to Juliette Touma, who speaks for UNRWA, that's the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees. And she's just been to Gaza herself and joins us now from Jordan's capital, Amman. Juliette, what has been your reaction to the resumption of fighting in Gaza?
Well, we are beyond worried at this stage for the bombardment and airstrikes that have continued across the Gaza Strip, including in the south, where we have teams on the ground, and also the lack of any deliveries today, any deliveries of humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip.
Now, were humanitarian organizations prepared for this renewed fighting?
Look, we do have some supplies in the Gaza Strip, but we continue to deliver those supplies, and the supplies run out fast, like we've seen in the early days of the war. So the lack of resumption of that humanitarian flow, which we've seen during the pause, is extremely worrying, and it should resume as soon as possible, including the much-needed deliveries of fuel.
Now, what can you tell us about the humanitarian situation there in Gaza at the moment?
At UNRWA, only at UNRWA, we are hosting more than 1 million people who were forced to flee their homes, and they are in UNRWA shelters across the Gaza Strip. I visited one of those shelters in the south. It had 30,000 people in it, overcrowded. People lacked the very basics, and this is before this short pause began. We could hear the sound of bombardment. People were still arriving to the shelter when we were there, even though it's been almost 50 days to the war. People lost everything, and they needed everything. One man was forced to sleep on the concrete ground because UNRWA had run out of mattresses. Some kids were going around wearing their open shoes because when they moved to the shelter, the weather was still good. When I was there, it had just rained and the temperature has dropped. So people are missing out on everything. This is exactly why the resumption of aid flows into the Gaza Strip is absolutely critical.
And do you still think that you can bring more aid into Gaza?
Of course we can. We are ready to bring aid in like we have been over the past weeks. UNRWA is there at the border. We will pick up those trucks of aid, and then we will distribute them to people in need. Like I said, 1 million people in our shelters, huge and overwhelming humanitarian needs in Gaza. Aid must continue to flow into the Gaza Strip.
Juliette Touma there from UNRWA. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner speaks for the Israeli military, and he told us earlier why Israel resumed the fighting.
Hamas chose to violate the ceasefire when they chose not to release the women and children. This is a very clear violation. It was absolutely apparent from day one that it was only a matter of time until Hamas decides not to transfer the hostages. We've been saying since the 7th of October, since that ruthless day, merciless day of attacks against Israeli people, that there are two goals for this war. First of all, to bring home all of the hostages, every last one of them. And second of all, to destroy and dismantle Hamas as a governing authority in the Gaza Strip.
Now, Hiba Tibi is West Bank and Gaza Country Director for CARE. That's an NGO fighting poverty and social injustice. She joins us from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Welcome to DW. Could we start, please, with your reaction to the end of this truce?
I don't have even, honestly, some words to describe how we all feel as humanitarian actors, as human beings. We had the chance to take a short period of breath, but now we are holding it back. Unfortunately, everyone is really afraid with the fact that what happened in the north might be extended to the south, where already people were overcrowded. Now, the new platforms of communicating with people, asking them to further evacuate, makes Gaza or the south of Gaza divided into small blocks. And this will mean that people are going to be overcrowded. And this will make what the situation that is already announced as catastrophic by the UN agencies to be even more catastrophic, with high potential of famine and wider spread of diseases at a scary scale that we are so worried about as humanitarian organizations.
Right. So are you still able to operate? Are you still able to bring in and distribute aid?
My dear Phil, we used every second, every moment of the last 7 days, and we were able to distribute water. We were able to distribute hygiene kits. We reached to the people, of course, limited numbers. But now, with the truce being ended, with the size of shelling that is taking place, and the geographic coverage of the different places where the airstrikes are operating, we cannot risk the very scarce, of course, the lives of our humanitarian colleagues, and also the very scarce humanitarian necessities that we have, very limited ones that we have. So we stopped our operations in the current moment.
Understood. So you've stopped your operation. You've withdrawn your people from the territory, have you?
No. They are in the south. My colleagues are all of the colleagues from CARE International in Gaza are from Gaza. All of them are in the south. They are still they are willing to help and to continue supporting the people, even in those very, very hard and harsh moments. Of course, we also operate through our partners who are also willing to support the people during the truce. And even sometimes we are asking them not to continue beyond now in the current very risky moment. So we ask them to stop, but all of them are in the south, ready to jump to contribute to the help.
OK, let's hope that there is then another pause in fighting for now, though. Thank you so much for joining us. Hiba Tibi from CARE. Let's see if we can pull all this together with DW's Middle East analyst, Shani Razan. So welcome back to the studio, Shani. We'll start with the ceasefire. Why do you think this latest extension failed?
Well, we've seen in the last 24 hours an erosion of the trust, the very little trust that was there so far between Hamas and Israel. already the night before, I mean, the 24 hours before this, the last release were very contentious, a lot of back and forth between the sides on what exactly does the list include, because Hamas was suggesting maybe to release some bodies of dead or victims, Israelis, and Israel was pushing back against that, claiming the priority is first to release live hostages. And so this back and forth was clear that both sides are toughening up their positions. And then yesterday also we saw an attack in Jerusalem, the Israeli capital, by Hamas militants in a bus stop leading to the death of 3 Israelis and several more severely wounded. It's very hard for Netanyahu, to be talking truce and with Hamas in Gaza, but at the same time being, by the very same organization, not seeming tough enough when other attacks happen in Israel. So that was putting a lot of pressure on the Israeli government.
It's tricky for those of us who don't follow these matters clearly. So we have a truce, but we know that within the truce, even as it was operating for the 7 days, there were skirmishes and there was rocket fire. So how is the line drawn between those sort of skirmishes and, OK, this is enough?
That's a great question. Nobody really knows when do you go past the line, when you cross it. We have seen trickling of a little bit of exchange back and forth, but the general framework worked because there was a belief that both sides need it. Hamas needs more time, needs more aid coming into Gaza, needs fuel, needs humanitarian support, and Israel wanted to bring as many hostages home as possible and there's no better way than the deal. However, both sides, we've been saying in rhetorics and in statements in the last 24 hours, were eager to show that they are not afraid of resuming the fire whenever needed. This is also part of the game, of this back and forth between the sides. Some of it has manipulation or psychological warfare elements. Some of it is the genuine hostility between the sides. We still see a lot of pressure. Qatar is still hoping to be able to resume, some sort of truce before we see escalation that goes out of hand. The next couple of hours will be quite crucial for that. It's too soon to see if that is even possible.
We just heard from Peter Lerner from the IDF, and he repeated the Israeli line that this is because not only did Hamas break the ceasefire, but they will not release the women and children as we have insisted. So we've dealt with the breaking of the ceasefire. This notion of women and children having to come out first, is that a deal that was agreed?
That's a framework.
And that Hamas and that Israel believes that Hamas has violated, or has that been part of the negotiation? And this is a term that Israel wants, but Hamas has said no to.
Well, no. The framework that was established over 8 days ago was about the children and their mothers, women and children, because...
So men were always out of this deal.
Correct, because we also need to remember part of the truce was also release of Palestinian prisoners held in Israel. And that was also under the same category, minors and women. So, because the way Israel sees it, the way Hamas sees it, whenever you start talking about men, elderly men on, hostages in Gaza, you would have to also discuss elderly men, prisoners held in Israel. That would be harder for Israel to release because the men that are kept in Israeli prisons, Palestinian ones, are usually those who have been convicted of terror attacks and some heavy crimes, unlike what we've seen so far in release of prisoners so far. So the minute you change the consistency of the kind of people you release, the category of people being released, you got to open the deal and renegotiate all the terms, and that's where both sides are too far from each other. This is where the distrust is too big, and this is why we've seen this collapsing.
OK, Shani, thank you for that. Thank you for walking through us that so clearly.
You're
Shani
welcome,
Rosanis is DW's Middle East analyst.